All opinions and analyses expressed on this podcast are the personal views of the hosts and the guests and do not reflect the views of any affiliated or unaffiliated organization.
All right, welcome back to our fifth episode here at Schmutz. It's been a while since the last one, and yeah, I think we all know why. There's obviously a lot going on right now, especially with the ongoing war between United States of America and Iran, which escalated pretty quickly at the end of February after major strikes and Iranian targets. So yeah, this episode is going to be about exactly that, trying to make sense of what's happening, what the goals even are, and whether any of this is actually making sense. But before we get into all of that, I just have to ask my friend and co-host Amit, where are you right now? Are you already in a shelter or what?
So, hello everybody, and it's good to be here again on the show with you. I'm in Tel Aviv or near Tel Aviv. At the moment, I'm not in the shelter, but there is a good chance I will have to run there during the recording session. We have had a few sleepless nights and a few sleepless days as well. And I spent way too long in the bunker or in the bunkers of Tel Aviv recently. But it's part of the experience, and I take it as an experience for life. Can't say I'm particularly uncomfortable about the situation, and I feel very privileged to have all these protections around me and all the good people who are going through this period with me. But yeah, overall, it's been exhausting, and it's been a very interesting experience. One interesting thing about war on the ground, and it's something that many people don't really estimate before they manage to get themselves into these situations, is that you actually have a lot of downtime. You have a lot of time to think. You have a lot of time to just sit there and wait for the next thing to happen. It's definitely not constant action all the time, and that's true whether you're a civilian, whether you're a reservist, whether you're a soldier. You get a lot of downtime to just sit around and think, and while you're waiting for the next strike that might kill you. And I've been thinking a lot about what's going on in the Middle East and how it might shape geopolitics and history for the next century. And I think it's very clear to everyone that we are standing now at the beginning, or maybe in the middle, of something very, very big, very major, that will shape the way our world is viewed and experienced across really different cultures and different regimes. And I wrote a few questions that I would like to discuss with you, Niklas.
Dude,
And
that's the reason why you're here.
yeah, exactly. See your Western perspective on that, and see if we see eye to eye, or if our analyses meet in the middle when it comes to this conflict. And I think that the first question, and the biggest one that everyone is asking right now, is this war, is this intervention successful, or is it a mistake? Is it yet another American intervention in the Middle East without too much thought into it that will end up as a disaster for America and maybe for Israel as well? Or is it a well thought out intervention with very clear goals and very set objectives? What do you think? How do you see this?
Okay, that's a very, very great question. And from my personal perspective, I can say, 2 weeks ago, I really want to visit you and I want to come to Tel Aviv. The second was my second attempt. But when you sent me the message where it's war, baby, and for that reason, it was not possible to visit you. And from a personal perspective, of course, just to visit you was not successful.
It's funny. But it's the second time it's happening, because the first time you booked a flight to visit me, it was in July, right before, or in June, before the first round with Iran started.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But no, to be serious right now, when we ask whether this war is a success or like a mistake, I think the first thing is from which perspective we have to look at. If you take from a European perspective right now, the current economic situation right now, it's to seem like a mistake right now. So we're dealing with many problems right now in Europe: supply shortages, rising costs, and like a general sense of economic uncertainty. So from that angle, the consequences already felt quite negative. But if you're going to shift it from a military perspective, the questions became about capabilities and military capabilities. So does it really make sense to engage in a conflict with a country like Iran with around about 90 million persons who have significant military resources, which is quite difficult for me to understand there. For example, if you look from a history point, when America had the Desert Storm operation in 1991, were engaging and deployed around 500,000 troops there, including like large-scale ground forces as well. So that level of commitment isn't what we're seeing right now. So it is very difficult right now to understand and to estimate the situation right now. I think military, it could be like a success, like from European perspective, on economic perspective, I would say it's not a big, it is a mistake. So
Right. I think that when we ask the question of is it successful or is it a mistake, what we need to look at is what are the goals of the war, right? And I think you've touched on something interesting here because you're saying that from an economic perspective, it might be a failure, and from a geopolitical, military, whatever perspective, it might be a success.
yeah,
Look, I think that one of the reasons that I asked you to record this podcast is because obviously there is a lot of chatter going on in the media, and also between people about what's going on here and all these different variables. And I think that it's very important to cut through the noise and really look at it from a cold, calculated geopolitical perspective, very simply, and ask, first of all, what are the goals of each and every one of the belligerents of this conflict? First of all, as we know, Israel and Iran fought a 12-day war in June of 2025, June, July, I think. And Israel had to stop its offensive, or wanted to stop its offensive, after 12 days because of Trump. Trump intervened and helped Israel bomb or finish off some of Iran's nuclear facilities. And in exchange, Israel was forced to stop its offensive and adhere to Trump's instructions on how this should be handled. Since then, the Iranian people have started not revolting is a big word, but protesting the regime and the situation in their country. And Israel and the US saw an opportunity to finish what was started on this 12-day war. And now we have to ask a question: what was actually the goal of the 12-day war? What was started back then that needs to be finished now? So from the Israeli side, it's very simple. Israel wants a 15-year reset of Iran's nuclear program. He doesn't want to destroy the nuclear program. He wants a 15-year reset, a kind of reset that will give it peace for a very long time. And maybe during this almost 2 decades, some things will change in Iran about its leadership, and we won't have to worry about another conflict with them. That's the first objective. Second objective is that during the 12-day war, it became very clear that Iran has some pretty devastating missile capabilities that are able to do more damage to the Israeli rear than we are used to. And another objective was to destroy the Iranian weapons industry as much as possible. So these are the two things that they are doing at the moment, from the Israeli side. From the American side, we are looking at more complicated geopolitical things, that considerations that I think we will talk more about as this conversation continues. But overall, the U.S. wants, as it already did in Venezuela, it wants to go after the oil suppliers of China and turn them into oil suppliers for the U.S., or just have them stop supplying China. And Iran is one of these suppliers. Now the Iranians, and that's where it gets interesting, Iran wants to survive, and it wants to demonstrate that it is not Japan, it is not Germany. The West doesn't understand it enough to come there and to make it submit or capitulate or accept terms that are unacceptable for Islamic people, for Shiites specifically, and for the Iranian people, for Middle Eastern people. And this is the goal of Iran. And to achieve this goal, they are looking exactly at what you said. They are looking at asymmetric warfare through an economic victory over the US and Israel and Europe, through pressure that will cause global recession and hurt a lot of people in the West through that. What do you think about that?
Well, to be honest, I wouldn't go be that far. I really understand the Iranian perspective right now, but I don't think that, the economic circumstance, economic reasons are in the foreground right now. So just to make it very simple right now, if a country like Iran is under attack, so what they're doing right now, they're going to defend themselves, yeah, first of all. It's not about, to try to disturb the economic system there. It's not about to start a global war against many other, countries in the Middle East, right? We saw this huge attacks on Saudi Arabia, against the Emirates, against Qatar, against Bahrain, of course, many missiles and many drones to Israel. Also, some drones were flying towards Cyprus to the British military bases there. So just to make it very simple, like country like Iran is under attack, like every other country, like one country is under attack. They try to defend themselves. And this makes me, for example, because Iran didn't start this war, to be honest, America and Israel had the first strike there. We can see that like, each country has the right to defend themselves. So I'm not, question and not make it to relative all the Iranian steps right now. But I see, for example, that Iranians just first of all defending themselves.
It's an interesting perspective, because something funny I've seen in discourse around the world nowadays is that people in the West, especially in Europe, they tend to be more understanding towards Iran than many Iranian people themselves. So I've heard, at least I've seen, that there is very strong opposition amongst Iranians against their regime, to a point that you can see many Iranians, especially people who don't live there, supporting this intervention and supporting this war. And again, it's all hypothetical, yeah. But if we had an Iranian person sitting here with us, he might not be comfortable with your answer. So it's interesting that don't you think it's interesting that many people in the West are more lenient on the Iranian regime than the Iranian people themselves?
It's quite difficult to find a question on that, because most of the Iranians we know in the West are the Iranians from diaspora, and these are not quite representative for the Iranians in Iran. So these mostly Iranian diasporas predominantly in America, in Germany, also in the UK, in France, they're pretty good educated. So they've got, in comparison, they're very good educated. They've got very good jobs. They are totally curse the entire regime right now in Iran, and they're of course against the Ayatollah regime and against the Mullah regime. But to have a clear understanding of the country right now, we have to look to the box and to the domestic politics of Iran. And most of the Iranians, of course, they live in bigger cities, of course. But when you go back to the revolution in 1979, the revolution was made not by the intellectual guys, not by the guys from the cities, the good educated persons, but by farmers, by persons who are not very educated, who live outside the bigger cities. So, and I think in the debate right now to start also like a regime change, what President Trump and many other Western leaders were talking about, they're totally overlooking that fact, and they just saw the big demonstrations in Tehran, but they're overlooking the situation in the land sides of Iran. And, you have to convince the ordinary people, the proletariat, if you want to say that like this, to really start a revolution there. If you cannot convince like ordinary people, not the educated persons, so just the ordinary people who live like in villages and little tribes there, and they're strong in their religious belief, I don't think this is like a good option there.
Do you think that, or what makes you think that Trump and Israel and maybe others are after a regime change in Iran right now?
You're asking about the intentions, Vero.
So
I don't know. I don't know the intentions of America and Iran, of America and Israel, but we just can analyze the statements and the speeches of the presidents there. What their true intentions are, we just can't spitballing about. We can just guess about that. So it is quite tough right now, and the war is happening now for 2 weeks right now, and to really see a specific objective there is quite difficult. Even we have also to analyze that America has also some other problems there. So they've got the next elections in a couple of months, and like having a foreign war, it's not very popular in domestic politics in America. So I can guess that Trump have to declare like a victory in a couple of weeks where said, okay, mission accomplished. America had a great victory there. Then they try to withdraw out of Iran so they can have a better possibility for the next elections there. So I think also the domestic point in that conflict is also seen. And that's a very tricky thing for Israel right now, because if Americans are out and try to withdraw, Israel is facing Iran again alone. Well, not alone. They have many the Saudis there and the Qataris and Bahrain. But just to be honest, it's not like a real partnership. Yeah, you know the situation better. That the relationship between Saudi Arabia and the Emirates to Israel is it's not very good. Yeah. What do you think? Is that war like a success, or do you what are the real objectives here? If you view from Israel point of view.
You said a lot of things that I have to comment on, and I hope I don't forget anything. First of all, when you talk about Saudis and especially the Emiratis and their relationship to Israel, I strongly disagree with you, especially from the Emirati side. I'm talking again about strategic partnerships between the countries, not about friendships between the peoples. There it's a little bit more complicated, but I know for a fact, because it's related to my work. I cannot discuss my job here because it's sensitive, but there are very, very strong partnerships between Israel and especially the UAE, and also indirectly Saudi Arabia. So that's one thing. Secondly, you mentioned that America, for domestic politics in America, it's bad to have a foreign war, especially around elections. And this is where, in German we say jein, so it's like yes and no. This is where I would say yes and no, because this is likely one of the goals of America, is to show that, yeah, America can still win wars. America can still intervene. America can still win wars. And that's a gamble by Trump to project victory in a way that looks decisive and definitive by the Americans. And if he manages that, that would actually boost his popularity, most likely. That's what I hear from American friends of mine. And it makes sense to me, because what he did in Venezuela, it was unpopular by around human rights activists and all these people, but generally speaking, it was a demonstration of American power. And I think what he's doing in Iran is taking it to the next level. And this is where we really tap into the psychology of a superpower, but we are going to talk about it later, because that's not what I wanted to talk about. You were talking about media statements, and I think that's the point I wanted to make. And that's sorry, yeah.
Sorry, just one point which I really want to comment there. I don't think that this war is currently very popular in America. Perhaps right now, if Americans made a clear victory there, but if we go back to history, for example, many wars against in the Middle East, for example, like the Iraqi war in 2003, the Afghan war, was quite unpopular right now, and also in America, because you said America can win this war. My point is that after the Second World War, America never had a clear victory and never won a war. And that's what I would strongly disagree with you. America will never lose a battle, but will never have a clear victory like the end of the Second World War. They had a strong and tremendous victory against Germany. They've got a tremendous victory against Japan. But especially in the Middle East, America always went to the same quagmire. And I think they're trying and tapping in the same quagmire right now in this war. So, of course, perhaps they're going to win this battle, but the possibility of a civil war is quite high. And we can see it many times when America had an out-of-area operation and military operations where you can see many case examples where there are a lot of civil wars, or civil war in Libya after the US and European intervention. There was a civil war in Syria. There was, during the Operation Iraqi Freedom, was a big civil war in the Iraq, and the possibility that a civil war can also happen in Iran is also very high. And having a civil war between 90 million persons in Iran is quite.
You touched on something that I think is often, I wouldn't say a mistake, but it's often a difficulty when you discuss wars and conflicts in the West. And it's that World War II is often used as the example of what victory looks like and what winning a war looks like, what it means to reshape the world order. But we have to be real. The World War II was the outlier. It's not the rule. It's the exception. Because even if we look at World War I, the end of World War I wasn't as clean as the end of World War II. It wasn't as definitive as the end of World War II. World War II is really an outlier, as far as I know, in world history, where really victory was definitive, history was reshaped. I mean, maybe these things happened in the Roman times when they conquered a province and they enslaved the population and they declared Roman victory, but that's not what wars look like today. So again, I think that looking at this from that perspective, that America didn't, since World War II, hasn't managed to do what it managed to do with Germany and Japan, it's, again, it depends on how you look at it, because I think it was a very unique sort of war, and this is not a template for what conflicts should look like. And this is where I want to get into something very important, because again, the goal of this podcast that we're doing is to cut through the noise and to talk about things in the simplest and most straightforward way that we can, without too much interpretation. And I think that one thing that we have to recognize is that this isn't the 90s. You know, social media and even traditional media plays a very big role in the world nowadays, and in warfare especially. And where Russia and Iran and maybe also China not so much, but Russia and Iran especially, have these subversion tactics of sowing dissent in European and American societies through information warfare. America and Israel, again, let's go back to the 12-day war. They did something very interesting and very subtle. And what I want to claim is that they are still doing it right now much more than most people would realize. And what they are doing is that they are planting deception in media. And for example, we can talk about the weeks leading up to the 12-day war in the summer, last summer. There was a lot of media talk about a rift or a very big disagreement between Benjamin Netanyahu and Donald Trump. It even seemed for a moment like that support that Trump was giving Israel was about to run out. And what happened after? Israel attacked with full American backing, and America came and did the finishing foot on the final night of the war. And I would argue, and I think it's very clear, that if you cut through the noise, you're going to see something very, very clear. The war started, and about 48 hours or a little bit more after that, you already got on all media outlets talk about, oh, a miscalculation might have happened, or maybe this war is a mistake, maybe it was not carefully planned, maybe it's not going the way it was meant to go, maybe regime change is not really feasible. Suddenly you get, especially in Western media outlets, a lot of talk like that, in a suspiciously coordinated fashion. And I think it's pretty clear that Israel and the US are planting disinformation in the media, or are using the media to make the enemy lower their guard. And
I'm sorry, which kind of media we're talking about? About independent media or like
every media? We're talking about news, especially on the news, especially on social media as well. I think it's very clear that when you get people talking about, like what you've said, it's not going according to plan, maybe it was a mistake, maybe the cost is too high, maybe it'll be a war of attrition. This was, to me, it seemed like something very orchestrated, because it happened immediately after the war started. And this is a war that had been planned, and it's something that was confirmed. It had been planned by both America and Israel for many, many months. And I simply cannot believe that they miscalculated too much, or that they didn't take the things that are happening into consideration. I simply cannot believe that. And I think that and the whole talk about regime change, and we will discuss it in depth later, because I want to hear what you have to say about it. But this whole talk about regime change is more of a tactic meant to make the Iranians concentrate on survival, rather than concentrate on all the other things that Israel is actually going after. So, namely the nuclear program, then the missiles. Iran is now operating from the lowest common denominator, which is IRGC. IRGC has to survive. So even if we have no nukes and no missiles and no infrastructure and even no energy, we survived. So we won. And that's something very deliberate that Israel and the US tried to make the Iranians believe, and I think very successfully so, that survival means victory. And if survival means victory, it means that a lot of other goals can be achieved, because they are not considered victory for Iran. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I got this point. Yeah, that makes quite of sense. But to be honest about preparation, and you already mentioned that of course this operation was highly planned, and especially in media we saw like the 2 aircraft carriers, heading towards the Middle East where like it was like a 4 or 6 weeks planning operation there. There a lot of guessing on the media where if the Americans will attack, if it's just like making pressure to the Iranian government to restarting the nuclear program. We saw many times. We saw Witkoff and Kushner negotiating with the Iranians there, first in Geneva, then in Austria. Well, not in Austria, I think that was the week after the war started on a weekend, and they postponed it to Monday.
It was a decoy. It was a decoy. The meeting.
Totally, yeah. And also this kind of negotiations what I already made. I have no idea if that was the original intention with America to have a clear and really good deal with the Iranians, or it's just like also like a certain kind of deceptions to attack the Iran. Or was perhaps it could also like a very Trump thing that he was very not decisive there and said, okay, now we do it, because many US generals were strongly opposed to that conflict and said, well, Trump, don't do that, yeah. And Trump was dragged into this conflict, yeah. So it's quite difficult to really see what deception is about. But to tell you, your point is totally right about the deception and the social media influence on Americans, especially.
One more point, just because you mentioned many generals opposing the war. And I say this very carefully because I don't have real information to back this, but I do know the military enough and politics enough to make this very carefully to make this point. And it's that you need to think about the things they don't say, not about the things they do say. If they go on the media and they say, we strongly oppose President Trump's plan, you have to ask yourself, why are they going on the media and saying that? This is, if we do end up in war, this is only going to weaken us. What's the point of saying that? And then you realize that maybe they don't actually mean what they say. Maybe it's part of the game, not necessarily. But maybe it is. I say these things carefully because I really don't know, but you have to really tap into, I think for civilians or people who don't work for government or who are not in the military, I think one of the good thing about this conversation is that we both have some military background and some government background as well. And I think that for people who don't have neither military background nor policy background and government work background, they tend to think about these things as the government is like a board of directors in a company that takes decisions on the fly. And it's like things are heavily protocoled, and the more you get to know the system, the more you see that what's actually happening is the things that no one talks about. And the things that people do talk about are the things that normally they're not necessarily a decoy, but they are not taken as seriously as the things that are out of the conversation. And this leads me to another point about information warfare and media signaling. And it's that when we look at media statements, we also need to, I think a clever way to approach this is to look at a statement and try to think, who is the statement actually aimed for? That's the way I try to read the media. So when you see, for example, I watch a lot of Channel 12 in Israel. This is like the most common news channel in the country at the moment. One of the most mainstream, like common news channels in the country. And sometimes you get board specialists there who sit and discuss the situation and present a very confused image of a miscalculated war and talking about how we might be dragged into a war of attrition, um, and making these statements. And obviously, some of these statements are legitimate. So I'm not trying to delegitimize any person who says that. But if you think about the media as a tool for warfare, you need to ask yourself, why are they making these statements and who are they talking to? And here it's pretty clear they're talking to the regime and to its supporters, and they're trying to make them lower their guard and may give them a good feeling that they're winning. On the other hand, sometimes you get contradicting statements that say, this is a once in a lifetime chance for the Iranian people to retake their country. And then it's very clear that these statements are aimed towards the Iranian people. Then you have statements and you especially see it by military officials who say things like, we have the most advanced early warning and missile interception systems in the world. And this, it's true, but that's meant to mask some things as well. Because I haven't mentioned that in the beginning, but we have been hit by cluster bombs recently. So it's basically missiles that split into many small ordinances that hit many different parts of the country upon impact when the missile is intercepted. And Israel has had a not so easy time intercepting these things. And if you go on the news or you go on the media and you search for an answer of whether the Iron Dome can intercept cluster bombs, so not the missile itself, but the cluster bombs that are dropped by the missile, you will not find an answer. You will not find an answer. And again, I'm not trying to be conspiratorial. I'm just saying there are things that they want you to know, and there are things that, that they would rather keep to themselves. Another thing is that we've had a few direct hits here in the center of Israel, and you ask yourself, how come, and in my opinion, they are reserving a lot of the munitions for the sensitive and strategic facilities like Dimona or Air Force bases. But again, I make these statements very carefully because I don't have inside information about that. But that's my assessment of that.
So that is a very interesting point you made. And of course, I totally got your point there. But the question is still, how much of information Israel and the Americans and West is spreading towards Iran is also receiving to the Iranian people. Because as you certainly know, most of the Pastaran and the Iranian government, the mullahs, are totally controlling the great majority of all media sphere. So perhaps there's a lack of sources there, or a lack of control there, where some information get through, and the possibility, that they say it, we can overthrow this regime, but I don't think that is that matter, right? And currently we're receiving some information because we are on a Wednesday evening, 7 p.m. right now, that Iran attacked Saudi Arabia. That's crazy. Do we have some information about that?
So you're right. So we just took a short break and we saw some interesting developments in the Middle East. Iran attacked in Riyadh, so in the Saudi capital, which is a pretty big thing. We don't know exactly what it attacked or what it aimed for. But earlier today, we are on the 18th of March, Israel attacked some of Iran's oil facilities. I don't know the exact technical details, but it is said that now Iran's oil production and shipment capabilities are 20% down. And this is a move that Israel and the Americans have been avoiding for quite a while, because obviously this would shock the whole global economy. But it is said that this move had been coordinated between Netanyahu and Trump, and it was limited to a 20% hit. At least that's what the media says. It was limited to this 20% degradation to send Iran a message. And what's happening now in response is that Iran is threatening an energy war. Qatar is evacuating some of its oil production facilities. And now we have this attack on Riyadh, which has just happened. So obviously we don't have all the information, and we don't wanna talk here on things that we are not certain about. So we will leave it at that. But that's definitely an interesting piece of the puzzle. And the point that I
And
did want to
the
make, sorry.
and the events are happening so fast. It's very, very tough to get all the information in structure. So that's crazy.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny because living here, you feel like you're living in a movie that is constantly changing and turning. So it's cool. It's a very interesting time to be alive, for sure.
Well,
So the actual questions that we wanted to discuss before the short break that we took, it was about the American interest, not specifically in this war, but more broadly in the Middle East. Like what's in it? It's a question that we hear very often. What's in it for America? Why does America do all these things? Why does America get dragged into wars that are more, they seem to be more in Israel's interest than in America's interest? And I have some idea, but I was wondering what you would have to say about that, because you come from a neutral background and maybe you have a clearer view on America's relationship to the Middle East.
America's relationship to the Middle East, yeah, I don't think that the Iranians really dragged America into this conflict. I think America is not very like a neutral actor there. I think also Iran is something personal for the most of the Americans there. If you go back to history, 79, the Iranian Revolution or the kidnapping in the American embassy in Tehran there, it was like yeah, a humiliation of a superpower there. So I guess from this perspective, there's some traumas America has in history, and this might be, of course, the Vietnam War and, of course, the Iranian Revolution. So I think that America has something strongly personal against Iran as well. So perhaps it's also make America blind to its original objectives, and they really want to have this regime changed. I'm very convinced about that. And to be honest, all in Europe also want a regime change. I mean, no one likes the Ayatollah and the Mullah regime, to be honest. But for America, it's something very, very personal, I would think. But to make this objectives, I think America is making a very, very big mistake, because they're misunderstanding the original perceptions and the background of the Iranian people. So I remember that Trump was making a statement a couple of weeks ago where he was threatening the Iranian regime with death, fire, and fury. And I guess America is making a bit mistake because they're misreading the perceptions of Iranian people, especially to Shia believers. So there's like a completely different relationship to concepts like sacrifice or material towards. So just in case example, after the Iran and Iraq war in 79 to 88, for example, there were reports of Iranian prisoners of war coming back home, and they're really feeling ashamed of, not relieved, but really ashamed of that they didn't had died as martyrs. So that's such a different framework compared to the Western thinking, where survival and life is usually the priority. So you cannot really threaten these people, and especially the Pastaran and the guards and the people that are in power to Iran, to threaten with death or fire and prove Trump dead. They really want this fight, and it's like an personal honor for many Shias to fight there and fight until the end. So this is a very, very difficult and different understanding of the American perception towards. And what do you think? You've got a similar idea about that, or do you strongly agree with the American perspective in that manner?
Yeah, no, absolutely. This is where I definitely agree with you. I think that a mentality in the Middle East that is really not clear, not to Americans and also not to Europeans, is that people would rather, some people, especially when you're going into the religious fundamentalists, also the Sunnis, by the way, you see it in Hamas and the Islamic Jihad in the Gaza Strip. They would rather sacrifice and live through death and destruction. I'm generalizing, of course, but that's the fighting ideology of some of these organizations. They would rather have that than reach an agreement that they think is humiliating, or live a very comfortable life that they think is not well deserved by them. And I think that this is it's a very strong misconception in America that that the Middle East is just like America's own backyard in South America, where you can just come in, you threaten the president, you snatch him from his bed, and everybody's shaking and nobody wants to die. And of course, I'm not saying that people in the Middle East want to die and don't care about their lives, but here, religious theology about war really gets into the considerations that these regimes are making when they are waging war, engaging with war, especially when the war feels righteous, such as a war against an imperialist invader like the United States. And I think that this is where Israel gets the Middle East much better. We are not perfect because the October 7th attack caught us completely by surprise because of that. So, during, it's a slightly different topic, but I think it's important. During the times of the pandemic, there was actually increased cooperation between Israel and the Palestinians enjoyed more freedoms in Israel, and their economy was looking a little bit better in the Gaza Strip. And Israel believed that, okay, maybe they are not deterred, but would they really want to launch an offensive against Israel if they are doing progressively better? And the answer is that, at least for Hamas, yes, because for them, it's not about living a comfortable life or having a democracy. For them, it's about self-sacrifice. And it's about building towards the ultimate goal through layers of generations that are destroyed by the cause that they're fighting for. And this is a very typically Iranian ideology as well by the Iranian elites, the Iranian regime. So yeah, absolutely, I agree with you that America is missing something here. But I think that another thing that we are missing is that we in, let's say in Europe, also in Israel, also in the Iranians in the Middle East, and then all sorts of people who live here, we equally don't understand the psychology of the United States, the psychology of a superpower. And since we only have one superpower left in the world, I mean, China is a rising power, but we don't have the Soviet Union anymore to counteract America. It's very easy to miss the psychological component of how a superpower operates and what a superpower is doing.
Especially,
and I think,
especially for my part in NATO. So, I mean, NATO strategy based on two pillars. It's deterrence and defense. And NATO is pretty much to avoid conflicts and to avoid a bigger military conflict in that regards to Russia. And for example, in NATO, it's not this kind of first strike strategy which America had many times in the Middle East. So that's also why many European countries are quite reserved about this military action right now, because in European history, we didn't, well, there's some examples, of course, which was launched by France and Britain. But in that regard, the strategy of deterrence and defense, or like an active combat or like a first strike strategy, which America did, is totally difficult for us to understand, because Europe and NATO is pretty much very defensive acting there. So that's quite difficult for me to understand as well. But also the concept of deterrence, do you think it's like that this entire concept of deterrence, I'm not talking about nuclear deterrence, just deterrence in general, to avoid conflict is possible when your opponent is something or someone who is quite radical? Or better, I ask it directly, so it's possible to deter terrorists?
I think that the question of whether it's possible to deter terrorists or not is a question that has been occupying the Israeli high command for 2 decades, basically ever since the 90s. I mean, conventional wars were fought with leaders like Saddam Hussein and Gamal Abdel Nasser, and there it was easier because they were radical, but a defeat is a defeat, and once they are done for, they are done for. But when it comes to religious fundamentalism and terrorism, you cannot really deter that, because for them, like I'm saying, they're going, if a whole generation dies, but they are one step closer to achieving their goal, they don't mind making the sacrifice. Again, I'm generalizing. So it's very hard to deter. The best thing probably to do about it, and I think that this is what Israel is trying to achieve in Iran, is to brainwash, and I'm doing that in quotation marks, to brainwash a generation out of this jihadic thinking, to convince a generation of people that not only does it not pay off, that, you know, in the end, many people become refugees and they want to move to Europe or to America, especially to Europe. And there is a reason that they want to move to Europe. They want to move to Europe because the lifestyle, the European lifestyle that cherishes life over sacrifice, allows for better existence. And I think that if you look at the young generation in Iran right now, they are very disillusioned by this religious fundamentalist view. At the same time, I think that with the Palestinians, it's much harder because they, honestly speaking, they don't have so much to lose. It's not like they can have a great nation if they stop resisting. They will still likely be under occupation or have not so great conditions for themselves. So it's a very hard question, and I don't have a definitive answer for you, but you definitely need to strike a balance between aggressive military action and showing them that what they're doing is not worth it, and also extending a hand for peace with those who do want to change their ways, like many of the Iranian people in the Iranian diaspora, for example. But I would like to get back to the psychology of America, because America, what they are trying to go for is deterrence through shock and awe. That's what they call it in their jargon. So through breathing fire down Middle Eastern cities, they're trying to create this deterrence. And again, we can talk a lot about the psychology of terrorism and why it doesn't work, but I think it's also very important to talk about the psychology of the superpower, the psychology of America. What's in it for America? Look, the Americans use Israel to project power. So if Israel decides wars, even if it doesn't create this ultimate deterrence against terrorism, Israel manages to decide wars and to remain a hegemon, at least militarily, in that part of the Middle East, thanks to F-35s, thanks to American radar systems, thanks to America's international backing. And that's what a superpower wants. It wants this kind of to project this luxury of, it's better to be on the side of America, because if I'm on the side of America, I will be fine. And I think that America interfering in the Middle East, one of the, it's maybe not the major reason, but one of the reasons, one of the ideological reasons at least, is trying to project this strength of, we don't forsake our allies, even when it's not comfortable for us. We will interfere on their side, and they decide wars because they have our technology. And even if we don't win a decisive victory, we are still with the upper hand because nobody beats American technology. And this makes countries drift towards the superpower. Now, there is a lot of talk in America about why are we doing this? And I think that this talk comes from something deeper. It comes not from why are we doing this? It's not in our interest. It comes from, do we even want to be a superpower that reaches out to other countries and convinces other countries through deterrence and through technology and through incentives to join our side? Why do we not just, we are a big country, why do we not just take what we have and live with it peacefully? Or what do you think? How do you see that?
So many informations there. And of course, having a partner like America on your side is very, very good for Israel, as well as, for the Americans to have Israel as a partner. But I totally get the point, having military superiority and technology superiority, of course, projects power there. And America, I think, is still in position to maintain this position as a superpower there, or Israel like a smaller power to change the status quo in the Middle East. Because to be honest, Israel is currently the only superpower who is able to change the status quo in the Middle East right now. Iran is very strong. Iran has a lot of capabilities there, but Iran will not strong enough, for example, to overthrow Saudi Arabia, to overthrow Iraq. First of all, they tried it in between 79 and 88. It was like, finally was a stalemate. But on the other hand, I also want to put that to a more global context there, is, where a lot of American material was putting from Southeast Asia, for South Korea, from Japan there, to the Middle East right now. And now many equipment is missing there in South Korea and Japan. So, which we can now brought to the quarter questions because we're just talking about Iran and America and Israel. But to see that from a global perspective, there are many other actors who are actually involved there. You have the Russians there, you've got the Chinese there. So America is now concentrating on the Middle East, and with many other conflicts right now, we've got the Russians in Ukraine and the possibility of China to attack Taiwan. And I'm not saying China is going to attack Taiwan tomorrow or perhaps the next week, but I can imagine that these kinds of conflicts, if it will happen again and again, that this could be like a wonderful window of opportunity for the Chinese to attack Taiwan. That if America is like in a global overstretching there and is concentrating on totally different points which are not in their main strategic interests. I mean, the Middle East is the main strategic and vital interest for America, but this could be like a very good opportunity for Chinese to, let's say, change the status quo there.
Yeah, I think that America is definitely in a catch-22 kind of situation right now, because on the one hand, since a few years, America has had this doctrine of pivot to Asia, so concentrating more and more resources in Asia to deter mostly China, also North Korea, because China is perceived by the Americans as a more direct competitor than, let's say, Iran in the Middle East, which seems at best like a proxy war on behalf of Israel. So, but in order to leave the Middle East, America needed to stabilize it, and it wants to leave as far as I understand it, it wants to leave the keys to the Middle East with Israel. And for that, it needs to fight alongside Israel and help it stabilize the Middle East. But as it's helping Israel stabilize the Middle East, like you're saying, the resources in Asia are thinning, and that's actually opening up for all sorts of moves on the Asian side of the map. And I'm not quite sure what's preventing that at the moment. We can talk to Jihao from China, who was here on the show. Maybe he would have some answers. I don't understand enough that part of the world to say. But I think that if we're talking about the global perspective, a very important aspect that we need to talk about is what this war actually about. We obviously talked about the tactical gains of the nuclear program and stabilizing the Middle East and maybe taking down the regime, but these are all very kind of micro goals that America and Israel are setting for the immediate future. If we talk about the geopolitical map of the world, that there are two competing economies at the moment in the world, and America and China, obviously. And you know that until 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine, Europe used to get many supplies from China, and it used to get its gas from Russia. And Europe relied on this cheap Russian gas and also on Chinese supplies. It's still relying on Chinese supplies. And the Russian gas was delivered through Gazprom. And the Chinese goods, they came sometimes through land, sometimes through sea. And China had that initiative called the Belt and Road Initiative, which was to connect Europe and China through a land corridor, sort of like the Silk Road that goes through Russia. Now, obviously, with the war in Ukraine, it all became more complicated. And that's when a competing initiative was founded in 2023, if I'm not mistaken. It's called the IMEC. So the India Middle East Corridor, India Middle East Europe Corridor, I think. And basically, it's a maritime and land corridor that bypasses the hostile countries or the countries that are aligned with China or the countries that are considered too radically Islamic, and goes only through pro-Western countries or democratic countries or somewhat democratic countries. Basically, the idea is to send gas through India from Saudi Arabia, through Jordan, through Israel, through Turkey and Azerbaijan, or directly through Greece into Europe to send gas and oil. And another option is to do it through Kazakhstan from the land borders, and Kazakhstan is constantly upgrading relations with Israel to probably to facilitate for that as well. I cannot say for sure, but that's one of the things that are going on. And and as you know, Iran stands between India and the Middle East. And Iran definitely isn't friendly to the IMEC, even though it is friendly to India. Um, so again, there is an international game here to divert resources from Southeast Asia to Europe through an axis that bypasses Russia. And my question for you now would be, this is definitely a European interest, this IMEC. And, you know, hurting Iran would improve IMEC's reach and capabilities. So why is Europe so uncertain about this war?
To be honest, I didn't have much research about IMEC right now, but for Europe, like a vital strategic interest right now to keep the shipping industry back to a European port sphere, and the economic reasons and the ships are quite stacked right now in the Strait of Hormuz are decisive for Europe's economy right now. And that's the reason perhaps why Europe is very reserved about this conflict and they don't want to participate in this conflict right now. And I totally understand your point that India is a potential very, very important partner for many European countries right now. And I totally got this point, but I don't think that is the main reason why Europe is so much or quite reserved in this conflict right now. But India is, of course, a very strategic, important partner in the couple of years, and why many great powers and superpowers quite make some resting games on which side India will participate. I think India is strong enough to be an own superpower or like a regional power in the future. Or it already is. I can imagine that. But in regard of all this conflict sphere, and we're talking about the potential conflict with the Chinese sphere, I think also Iran has some interest there and some strategic interest, of course. And we're thinking about, about the potential conflict with China. But I think that the current conflict is not much about Iran and Israel and America. I think the true conflict in that regard is the conflicts between Sunni and Shia religion. So I think this is the decisive point, what we have totally overlooked in the West right now. And we saw that Iran was already attacking Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia was also attacking Iran. And I think this is the decisive thing.
Right. And now I'd like to move on to the final topic that I wanted to talk about today. Obviously, we've been talking about Iran, we've been talking about the US and China and what's going on in the world. But there is one more front of this war that we should really not neglect, and it's the Lebanese front, because after more than 1 year of one-sided ceasefire where Hezbollah barely took any action against Israel and Israel was constantly taking action against Hezbollah, Hezbollah has now decided to join the war, and it has done so in full force, once again threatening Israel's northern regions and villages. More than Israel had expected it to threaten them, honestly. The threat is way bigger than expected. And now Israel is moving into Lebanon again with a stated goal of retaking the what they call the security strip. So it's basically a buffer zone from the Litani River all the way to the Israeli border, meant to concentrate the fighting between Israel and Hezbollah there. Interestingly, Israel had exactly that arrangement, and they withdrew in 2000. So it's interesting that 26 years later, it's moving in again to do the exact same operation. At least that's what we are told. I don't know the specifics of what they're planning. But there is one big difference now. And the difference is that this really just came in a few days ago. It was announced that France would facilitate for direct talks between the Lebanese government and the Israeli government, which is, it's unheard of. In Lebanon, it's criminalized to talk to Israel, and in Israel, it's criminalized to talk to Lebanon. So it's crazy that we are now seeing a potential for direct engagement and handshakes between these two governments. The Lebanese absolutely don't want another catastrophic war with Israel. And the Israeli side, once again, if the goal is to reshape the Middle East, then this could be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for us. And I'd like to revisit, because Niklas, you lived in Lebanon, and we already did a podcast about Israel and Lebanon and everything in between. And I'd like to revisit the question that we closed that podcast with and ask you that question again. Now, in this new context, do you see a possibility for normalization between Israel and Lebanon?
Yeah, I see a certain kind of opportunity there, but I see it's a predominant figure of Emmanuel Macron. So, as you certainly know, there are elections next year, and Macron is not able to get re-elected as a French president, and it's quite possible that France will have a very, very far-right government next year, and they are not pretty interested in the role as negotiator in the Middle East, pretty much. So I see this window of opportunity, especially Macron, and I see also some readiness for the Israelis to start with negotiations, of course, and of course for Lebanon. So the President Aoun, he's quite, in my opinion, a moderate man. He's a quite intelligent man, and Lebanon has much more troubles and much more problems right now than to start or restart a new war with Lebanon. And which Lebanon never really had a real war with Israel. It was mostly the Hezbollah there, but the Hezbollah is a very strong factor. And I see this as an opportunity, of course, if it's like possible or conceivable to have real peace with the Hezbollah. This is another question. So, but
Right. The
that's
peace
very
is not
difficult.
with the peace certainly wouldn't be with Hezbollah. I think that Israel has made it clear that any agreement with Lebanon would force the government to disarm Hezbollah completely. And by the way, the Lebanese government also, I think last week or 2 weeks ago, completely criminalized any armed operation that is not by the army in its borders, and also expelled all of its Iranian military advisors and things like that. So it's very much now the state versus Hezbollah. But the question is, can this really happen, that Israel and Lebanon come together and contain Hezbollah? And there is also Syria. I don't know if you've heard, but the Syrians are also they also have a long history. The Syrian new government has a long history of conflict with Hezbollah, and they're sitting on the border right now, and they're waiting for a command to move in and not join forces with Israel, but definitely take aim at Hezbollah and perhaps occupy some territories from Lebanon, because Lebanon used to be part of Syria. Syria still claims parts of Lebanon. So it's very complicated. But the question is, do you really see this happening in the way Macron would like it to happen, where Israel and the Lebanese government come together and through diplomacy somehow Hezbollah gets disarmed and something like that? Do you think it's realistic?
And look, well, the struggle with Hezbollah is pretty old, since the 80s, right? And Israel was doing a lot of things to try to break down the will and the spirit and the capabilities of Hezbollah. And only because Macron is now offering his goodwill or his opportunity to make a deal between the two countries, well, yeah, it's very nice for Macron that he offers himself for that deal, but doesn't make that very seriously that Hezbollah will also participate in this deal. So I don't think so. It's nice speech perhaps from Macron, but Hezbollah will never do so.
And if Hezbollah have nothing to lose, then they might as well just fire everything they have, and not just go without a fight. So it's their Samson's option.
Or one step forward, it could be like the new targets are not the Israelis anymore, but they can see or feel like some kind of cowardness, or that they make a deal with the so-called enemy Israel, that Hezbollah is also possible that going to attack the Christians or the Sunnis inside Lebanon, so that they're like a new target there. I mean, you can
Another civil war.
Of course, you can see what's happening when Assad in Egypt was making some deal with the Israelis. He won't make peace, but this was seen and interpreted by many Arabs as sort of kind of cowardice and like treason, and Sadat got assassinated on that.
He got assassinated, but the peace treaty lasted, and both Israel and Egypt benefit quite a bit from that peace treaty, even though the peoples are not exactly friendly to each other at the moment. I think another interesting piece of information, but that's really a story for another podcast, is it's the Syrian aspect, because like I said, Syria also has a claim for Lebanon, territorial claims in Lebanon, and Syria, the current government, is backed by Turkey. So let's say Trump backs Erdogan and Erdogan backs Ahmad Ashara. And there is kind of like a new axis forming against Hezbollah as well. But the Europeans and possibly also Israel favor direct engagement with the Lebanese. As far as I understand it, they favor direct engagement with the Lebanese over engagement with Syria, because Syria is a strong ally of Turkey, and it is already conceived that Turkey will be Israel's next big rival once Iran is done for, if Iran is done for. Not necessarily a military rival, but definitely an ideological rival in the neighborhood. So again, this is also very interesting where it's going. But unfortunately, we only have so much time, and we came here to talk about Iran in the clearest way we can. And we don't want to confuse anyone with any unnecessary information for that matter. So on that note,
the next episode, of course.
yeah, definitely. And then on that note, I'd like to move on to our usual end of show activity, which is the schmutz of the day, where we talk about the funnily messy business of world politics that has happened today or this week. So Niklas, I think you had something to share about the schmutz of the day.
In my mind, normally schmutz of the day is to have a certain cool news on that, but the schmutz of the day is today. I'm giving the schmutz of the day today to Donald Trump, to President Trump, because Trump is personally responsible that I could not enter Israel and visit you and many of my other friends in Israel. So my flight got cancelled there, and I'm going to blame Donald Trump for that. So Trump's
second time in a row.
Second time, yeah. But I hope the first and the third attempt will succeed. I'm pretty much sure about that.
We had I'll tell the viewers, we have an inside joke that Niklas booking a flight to Israel is a secret NATO code for the US to attack in Iran. That might be something like that. That's good.
It was
anyway.
A very, very good conversation. Thank you very much for having me, having you, whatsoever. And yeah, I guess we could put some light in the darkness of this very difficult and very horrible war right now. And I hope so that the situation is quite good under the circumstance for you, that you're not so many times in a shelter. I hope that you and your friends and family will be fine the next couple of weeks, a month. God only knows. And thank you very much for this wonderful discussion, and see you the next time.